Welcome to the state of Connecticut's kickoff to the Family First Prevention Services Act work. My name is Ken Meisterland. I'm currently the Bureau Chief for External Affairs for the department. Congratulations for all of you for securing a seat in this well sought after event. I have the distinction to give you a couple very tangible housekeeping items to keep in mind before we move through this morning. First and foremost, we are going to go straight through. We will not be taking a break, so if you need to get up and take a break or answer the phone, please feel free to do so. The restrooms are straight out the hallway to the right. Immediately on your right is the men's room. A little bit further down on the right is the ladies' room. We do have a number of people still in need of seats. So if you have an empty seat next to you, if you could just quickly raise your hand. It's like the beginning, it's like the front of the class, right? Nobody else. You will not have to do the role play if you sit close to the stage. There we go. All right, there we go. Great. So, yep. And if you could please as well silence your phones so we can minimize the disruptions as best we can. And again, if you have an empty seat next to you, if you can again quickly raise your hand. We still have some people coming in through the hallway. All right, tremendous. So at this point, it's really an honor for me to introduce to you our wonderful Commissioner, Commissioner Vanessa Durantis.
Thank you, Ken. Good morning, everyone. Governor Lamont will not be able to join us this morning. He will be with us, though, later in the week for our National Adoption Month festivities. But we have all of you here today, and we're really excited about this inside-outside look at what a federal legislation can mean for our child welfare system in Connecticut. We are very excited to have you all here. There's members of the DCF exec team and leadership team. If you all can raise your hands so people can see you. I see our chiefs of child welfare and different members of our team. And I see 200 of our closest friends. Good morning. I also see some members of our General Assembly. Can you all raise your hands? We'd like to acknowledge that. We see members of our transition team that kind of helped us over the first couple of months to really get our legs underneath us. And we see all of you. We have a jam-packed morning of information to share with you about what's literally one of the first major child welfare finance reforms in decades. It really is an opportunity for us to think differently about how we work together and how we work with children and families to advance not only the causes of our work, but to make kids better, stronger, and more resilient over the circumstances that may be in their communities and families. There are a few pieces of information in your folders to help guide you through this morning's presentations. You will see a quick primer by Casey Family Programs on the Family First Prevention Services Act summary. You will also hear us using the phrase family first. It's important for us to do that because anybody who's been in this field for any amount of time knows that we acronize everything. And if we just sit and FFPSA you to death, you lose the opportunity to really think about this being an opportunity to think about families and families first. What you also have in your packet is all of the presentations that our panelists will be working from today. So you'll have an opportunity to follow them along as they step you through each component of their work. And then you have our panelists' bios, so it will explain to you who they are and their connection to this work. Our keynote address this morning is going to be virtual. And we thought about if we should actually present a keynote, but we heard a presentation from Jerry Milner, who is the Associate Commissioner of the Children's Bureau in Washington, D.C. His presentation was so compelling that we said, let's not reinvent the wheel, because as he says it, what you'll hear is the opportunity for us to think differently. And we couldn't have said it any better. So if we could direct your attention to the screen, let's hear what Jerry has to say about the Family First Service Prevention Act.
I was last year for a meeting like this at the first Judicial Summit in 2005, with my then boss, Joan Old, who's here again today, presenting to a group very much like this, to a forum that was organized in large part by Justice Kathleen Blatz in Minnesota, Justice Judith Kay in New York, Justice Mark Hargan of Michigan. It's a pleasure to be back. It's frustrating to me that we're talking about the same things almost 15 years later. I'm not here, quite honestly, to talk about improving child welfare because our system, in my opinion, is fundamentally flawed. It waits until the damage is done before we intervene on behalf of children and their parents. I'm here today to talk about turning a system in a fundamentally different direction. I'm not here to make anybody feel comfortable. In fact, if anything I have to say today makes you feel comfortable, I would say that we have a problem. This is a call to action. I'm here with a message of urgency and a message of hope. The current trajectory of child welfare in our country is unsustainable. We cannot, in good conscience, allow this path to continue. How do we know that this is unsustainable? The facts are clear. As Judge Katie has already noted, the numbers of children entering foster care every year in our country continues to rise. As we sit here today, we have approximately 450,000 children in our foster care system, and the number is going up every year. 75% of the founded incidences of child abuse and neglect are from neglect, not horrific abuse of any kind. And most of those cases of neglect are somehow related to poverty. In our child welfare system, we continue to struggle with disparity, disproportionality of children and families of color in our system. We know that the trauma of child-parent separation can last a lifetime. And yet, as a system, we do very little to keep families safely together. In too many places, we remove children first and we ask questions later. In too many places, our default safety approach is out-of-home placement. Yet we have data, we have information, we have knowledge to know that many families can be kept together safely with the right kinds of supports. We failed as child welfare agencies, and I was the head of one of those child welfare agencies for a few years. We fail as agencies, we fail as courts, we fail as attorneys when we do not begin our work by asking families, what do you need? What can we do to help you, to mitigate the event, the concerns that brought you to us? We fail in our country to truly make reasonable efforts to prevent removal, even though it's been required by law since 1980. We fail to invest enough effort to find relatives, kinship care, others who can serve as sources of familial support, especially paternal resources. We're overly comfortable as a system with placing children in the homes of strangers, not fully appreciating the distress that this causes to children who we are removing from harm. In so doing, we sometimes very unintentionally cause more harm than we protect them from. We spend money, certainly at the federal level, on trying to come up with more evidence-based practices to fix the trauma after it has occurred, rather than trying to prevent the trauma from happening in the first place. We are a wait and react to what we can clearly see kind of a system. We are a wait until something happens, and something bad enough happens to get our attention and to offer our help to to families. I struggle, quite honestly, to make any sense out of doing that, any sense out of continuing to do our work when it is achieving the kinds of results that we get right now. The human cost, the financial cost of continuing to think of and do child welfare in the same way that we've done it for decades upon decades should be shocking to all of us. And yet, many of us accept it as normal, as inevitable, as out of our control. We accept it as the way that we do our business. I need only to recount an experience with a group of young adults that I met with recently just to highlight the absurdity of what our system has become. As David and I often do, we meet with groups of parents, groups of young people who have experienced our child welfare system firsthand, to understand their experiences, to understand how we have affected their lives in both positive and negative ways. Very recently, we met with a group of young adults who had spent time in foster care. As we went around the room, made introductions, every young adult began by saying, here's my name, and here's how long I was in foster care, and here's how many placements I've experienced. What does it say? What does it say about their identity and how they see themselves? If they introduce themselves by how many placements in foster care they had. A couple of the young adults mentioned having been in foster care for 18 years with 17 or 18 placements. In that particular meeting, the last young woman to introduce herself said she'd been in foster care for 17 years and had 45 different placements. Think about the impact that has on a child, on a teenager, on a fully grown adult who had that experience. I told that story at another meeting recently. And right afterwards, another young woman came up to me and said, thank you for highlighting that. I was in foster care for 12 years. And I had 88 different placements. Think about it. 12 years times 12 months, roughly 144 months. Imagine that for 12 years of your life, you had to pack up what you had every month and a half approximately. Change schools, lose friends if you were lucky enough to make those friends. Figure out the new rules, only to pack up again, to move one more time. Each one of those moves is a loss for those young people. And I'm here to tell you those stories are not outliers. We do this to kids every day. Each and every one of those moves makes it increasingly difficult for them to find the kinds of attachments that are necessary for becoming healthy, resilient adults. And then we wonder, how did they end up in the juvenile justice system? How did they end up in the adult justice system? I'll tell you, by reacting perfectly normal to what their lives experiences have been. Who among us in this room believes that that kind of an experience, moving from home to home, placement to placement, is in the best interest of a child? Who believes it will support a child's well-being? As a lifelong social worker, I've had a pretty long life, I find it reprehensible. I find it unconscionable that even unintentionally we do this over and over again to kids and to their families, and then we blame the kids for behaving in outrageous ways that absolutely reflect what their experiences have been. The inadequacies of our system are reflected in the words that parents and young people that we meet with almost every week use to describe their experiences in child welfare and in the court. Words such as fear, shame, intimidation, being overwhelmed, confused, hopeless, unseen, unheard, less than. Those words should give us tremendous pause for concern and great cause for reflection about what our child welfare system looks like. These are not words that communicate well-being, healing, safety, support, or justice. Our children deserve better than that. Their parents deserve better than that. And I would say to you that we, as a system, are better than that. Together, we can work to strengthen families, to reduce unnecessary parent-child separation, to disentangle the complexities of poverty and neglect, and to squarely address disparities in our child welfare system. So many of the inequities that we face as a society, poverty, oppression, disproportionate challenges for people of color, disconnected youth, those are all magnified to a great extent in our child welfare system, but it does not have to be that way. We can change it. We can, as the video depicted, reimagine a different, more effective, and more humane approach to serving, supporting families, and to keeping children safe. We can create a system that does bring justice to families. The status quo should absolutely not be acceptable, because the outcomes we're getting with the status quo right now, in my opinion, are pretty abysmal. We serve no one by trying to tweak a system that's set up to activate only after the harm is done, only after a report comes in saying a child has been abused and neglected. I've seen so many efforts to try to shore up a system that's founded on trying to fix the damage rather than trying to prevent the damage. If we want different outcomes, different experiences, we have to have a fundamentally different approach to child welfare in our country. We have to recognize that overwhelmingly, most parents love their children. And all children need parents. And the parents they need the most are their own parents. We have to adopt an approach that reflects what we know. As Judge Katie was so eloquent in identifying about affecting the lives of children and families, and act on that. We have to adopt an approach that recognizes that children exist in the context of their families, and that those families are their best support of protection and nurture when we can help them to be that. We want a system that truly recognizes that it is in the best interest of children to have healthy, thriving parents. And it's time that we invest in strengthening those protective capacities of all parents, not just those for whom a report of child abuse and neglect has been made. There are ways that we can get there. I'm going to highlight two ways very briefly for you. And I've never done anything briefly in my life. Trying here. First, we must work together to reduce the need for families to ever make contact with the child welfare system. It's one thing to talk about prevention in the context of preventing children from coming into the foster care system. When they get to that point, life has not been well for them. I'm talking about preventing the need for coming into contact with our child welfare system. How do we do that? We start out by listening to families. We start out by listening to parents and youth about what they need to stay healthy, strong together, by responding to what those voices tell us. We do it by creating networks of primary prevention supports They help families build, maintain their protective capacities when adversity strikes, as it so often will. Even if formal services are not in abundance, as in some rural areas, let me tell you, there's not a county out there that does not have some combination of a school, churches, doctor's office, public health department, Head Start Center, civic organizations that with leadership and vision cannot become the foundation for community-based prevention network. I grew up in one of the most rural areas of this country, and I'll put my cornfield and cotton field growing up place up against anybody's definition of rural here, and I know this to be true. Judges can play a critical role in providing that leadership because they see what families need every day. Most often they see what they've gone without in terms of having their needs met over the course of time. Judges see missed opportunities, and judges can speak out and lead the charge to help ensure that families get what it is they need long before court is ever necessary. We can do this by strengthening the capacity of parents to care for their children before there's ever a report of child abuse and neglect. But this requires us to have as part of our values and our vision a value attached to parents and to the parent-child relationship, as opposed to only valuing the rescue of children. We need to do more than just protect children from physical harm. We must give them what they need to thrive. The second way we can reimagine this child welfare system is that for those families who must be involved in child welfare, and for those children for whom there is no other option but to be served in foster care, we must dramatically change that experience. It's not acceptable to move them around 18 or 88 times. One of the ways that we do that is by ensuring that every parent and every child has access to high-quality legal representation, even before the initial hearing, so that their needs and their desires are put before the court and advocated for, and a critical role. I'm not talking about the role of a volunteer. I'm talking about the role of a lawyer who provides high-quality legal representation. We change that foster care experience by treating foster care as a support to entire families, insisting that foster resource families work with children's parents to support the children. I get a lot of hands going up when I go to that place. I believe it's doable. I believe it's necessary. We do it by normalizing the parent-child relationship while in foster care by never, ever using parent-child contact as reward and punishment. We do it when we take reasonable efforts seriously. The courts and the agencies. It's something, quite honestly, I do not have confidence that we do. For evidence of the importance of this, we need look no further than what a determination of reasonable efforts has become in so many situations. A check mark on a court order. Let me ask you, is it reasonable for a parent to have to use multiple forms of transportation, try to get child care, take off work, travel across a county, large city, to get an hour of counseling that may not be what she needed to begin with, and maybe cancel when she gets there? Is that a reasonable effort? Is that an active effort? Is it reasonable to expect that a referral alone for services will get a parent what they need without active advocacy to get them involved in that service? How active an effort, how reasonable an effort is handing someone a letter or a slip of paper? Is it reasonable to expect that parent-child relationships will grow and flourish when they only see each other once a week in an unnatural setting such as an office with a social worker sitting there observing them behind the window? And I'll be bold enough to say, is it reasonable to pay a foster family to care for a child often far away from everyone and everything those children know, rather than investing in the capacity of parents to care for their children safely in their own communities? None of that's reasonable. It's more common than not in our current system. But it is completely unreasonable, and it's very seldom acting. I want to share with you a specific example of a judge who I think is here, but I didn't ask his permission if I could call him out by name. I trust that he'll forgive me. I'm getting pretty accustomed to asking for forgiveness. When Judge Trent Favre became the family court judge in Hancock County, Mississippi in January of 2018, he inherited a very deeply troubled child welfare system. A system that I know firsthand, before and after. Far too many children in foster care, and far too few efforts to strengthen the capacity of families. Some call the work that he has done, in less than 2 years now, the Mississippi Miracle. He won't take credit for it, and it did take a team, but he showed the courage, the leadership, to shake up the status quo. Less than 2 years, he's helped to achieve over a 50% reduction in the number of children in care in that county. He's achieved a 75% reduction in the number of shelter hearings and a 75% reduction in the number of adjudications. All of this occurring while keeping children safe. There's been no upsurge in safety concerns. And take my word for it, he's got a media presence there that would absolutely highlight any upsurge in safety concerns. David and I wanted to see firsthand what was going on, to look behind the data. So we paid a visit down to Judge Favre in Mississippi. And I wanted to share with you a little of what we saw, what we learned. We saw kindness. We saw compassion on the bench. We saw a judge trying to understand the circumstances of individual families. A judge who tells families that it's his job to try to keep them together and keep them together safely. We saw a judge who brings together stakeholders in the community weekly to consider how they can improve services to children and to families. We all have to commit to taking our role that seriously in that context. We have to commit to a child welfare system that values families, that believes families can be helped, to avoid the travails that we spend every one of our days trying to fix. One that is committed to breaking harmful intergenerational, multi-generational cycles, maltreatment, family disruption. One that's focused on preventing bad things from happening to children and families. We understand, I understand, that by the time families reach your courts, oftentimes their circumstances are so dire that your options are incredibly limited. That's precisely why we have to go upstream to try to prevent those circumstances from becoming so dire. I routinely hear from judges across the country and agencies that say we can't serve children and families better because we don't have enough substance abuse treatment services to treat opioids. Well, folks, when I started carrying a caseload, I heard the same thing, but substitute opioids for marijuana. And then a little bit later, we can't do anything because of all the heroin. And then a little bit later, we can't do anything because of LSD or cocaine or meth. And now it's opioids. We're always going to have huge challenges. I cannot accept that as an excuse for not serving children and families better. I routinely hear judges and agencies say we live in a rural area. We have no services to offer. I routinely hear judges and agencies say we cannot place children in their own communities because we don't have enough foster homes. On all of those accounts, my response is this: you're right. And you never will have enough of any of those things if we continue business as usual. 20 years from now, we will hear the same laments, the same frustrations, and we'll see the next generation of traumatized adults who do not have what they need to care for their children. That's why we have to change our path, and we must change it now. Let's not wait for another summit in 15 years. The Supreme Courts, the administrative offices of courts, court improvement programs, attorneys, agencies can help propel this change. And it can change as soon as you arrive back home. Within your context, your legal or judicial context, the change that I'm calling on you to make looks like attorneys having reasonable caseloads so they can ethically represent their children, their parents. It looks like court improvement programs operating with the full weight and support of the Supreme Court to ensure the highest quality legal representation in your state, your territory, or your tribe. It looks like judges that are well informed about the trauma of family separation and who take reasonable efforts, findings very seriously. It looks like attorneys and judges demanding that case plans be tailored to the specific needs of families rather than boilerplate. It looks like the agency, the court, and the attorneys using removal truly as a last resort, only when it's necessary in the face of imminent danger. It looks like early appointment of counsel for children, for parents, for youth. It looks like judges, attorneys being well-versed in safety decision-making and the agency's practice model. It looks like the adoption of standards of legal representation and court rules requiring adequate training for judges and attorneys. It looks like robust family time for children in care and their parents that supports bonding and attachment. This summit and the work that is to follow are designed to put that level and that scope of change into motion. We want you to spend your time here developing specific ways in which courts, court improvement programs, attorneys, agencies can work together and channel Judge Katie again to be bold in making those changes. If we can begin that process here, it will be a giant step in the direction of a change system that can give us all hope. I get my hope from people like those who will be on the stage here if I ever give them a chance. And I'm about to. Discussing with you their experiences momentarily. These are parents. These are young people. These are resource families with first-hand experience. I get my hope from their resilience. the fact that they, in spite of everything, can be here as advocates, as experts. And I'm pleased to be a part of this. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to share time with you. And I'm looking forward to being with you over the course of the summit. Thank you very much.
One word thought. Just shout them out. Hope. I can't. Powerful. Change. What else?
Overdue.
Systemic. Yeah. What else? Transformative. Resources. Foundation. Empowerment. Finally. Yeah. That's a drop the mic right there from our SAC chair. As we transition into our panel, I want you to continue to think about the why that Jerry has outlined for us. And to think about what that will look like here in Connecticut. Because as we transition into really thinking about Family First Prevention and Services Act, we have to be prepared to think about the why. And be prepared to look ourselves in the mirror as a system that does really good in the deepest end. But how can we think about prevention farther, farther, farther upstream? That was the why. Our panelists are about to talk to you about just what is this and what does this look like across the country, and how do we start to think about families first in the context of what we are planning to do here in Connecticut, what we are already underway doing. I'd like to introduce first, with an overview of the Connecticut perspective, Susan Riley, the Senior Director of Strategic Counseling from Casey Family Programs. And again, her presentation is in your packet, and you can step through the slides as she gives us an overview of just kind of what this is and how we can start to think about it in our perspective.
So as the Commissioner said, I am Susan Riley, and I am with Casey Family Programs, which is a national operating foundation, the largest one in the country, focused on improving child welfare and improving outcomes for children and families. We work in all 50 states, plus DC and Puerto Rico, and I think one of my lucky colleagues also gets to go to the Virgin Islands. So we work across all 50 states. We work with 16 Native American tribal nations. We work with policymakers, judges, all in the effort to improve outcomes for kids and families. And I'm very privileged that I am assigned to work here in Connecticut with the leadership team at DCF and with legislators and judges right here in this state. My goal today is to provide you with a high-level overview. Can you go back to the opening slide? There we go. So a high-level overview of the Family First Prevention Services Act, and a look at the evidence-based component of that act. And then my colleagues up here are going to address other components. Second slide. Before discussing the Family First Prevention Services Act, also just known as Family First, I'd like to share a little bit of context. How did we arrive at the child welfare system that we have today? Jerry kept referencing the system that we have and how flawed it is. And so how did we really get here? I'd like to think that the Family First Act is a step towards a paradigm shift. And what is on earth is a paradigm? It's a theory, it's a group of ideas, it's a framework on how we think, how we make decisions, how we act. A paradigm shift is a change that happens when our way of thinking changes. When we replace our thinking with a very fundamentally different set of thoughts and beliefs. So I'd like to, again, suggest that a paradigm shift is what we need. Not just a change in words, but a change in beliefs and values. Next slide. So in order to see where we want to go, we need to look back at where we've been. Because underlying every paradigm is an ideology, a set of societal values and beliefs, and it's the basis of the way that we approach a problem. Next slide. So I bring to you a very brief history lesson. In colonial times, American society's response to families that could not care for their children was largely based on the English poor laws of the centuries before. This was a notion of the deserving and the undeserving poor. The response to children whose parents were poor, who were homeless or jobless, was to rescue them, to intervene and separate them from their parents so that they wouldn't wind up like their parents. Working with the poor was grounded in social Darwinism. It's based on survival of the fittest, right? Moral superiority, the belief that responsibility for one's problems was an individual basis. It was all centered on the individual rather than on the environment. The deviant family was the cause of the problem. Therefore, children needed to be rescued from poor parents, especially those whose race or ethnicity was different than those of the major culture. African American families, immigrant families, Native American families, all tended to fall in that undeserving poor. Next slide. The worthy and unworthy. Can we click to the next slide? There we go. There we go. The worthy and unworthy poor ideology created a tension between the values of rescuing children. Can you go back one? Okay. I'll just go ahead. The slides will catch up to us. The worthy and unworthy poor ideology created a tension between the values of rescuing children and supporting families. At one end of the continuum, children of the unworthy poor were saved by separation from their parents and were indentured or placed in orphanages. At the other end is an understanding that the environmental influences and societal beliefs and biases can contribute to social and individual problems. The 19th century belief system strongly held that individuals are responsible for their conditions, and so our child welfare system was built. And the fundamental pillar of child protection in the United States is based on the child rescue orientation. If you can find it, it would be on slide 6. So another major tension involves the varying perspectives on the role of government. Until the early years of the 20th century, government played a very minimal role in the protection and care of children. Instead, charitable, religious, philanthropic institutions led and shaped the response of these vulnerable children, primarily the poor, by rescuing them from the poor families, and they became orphaned, abandoned, and unsupervised. But we still feel the tension about government interference in families' lives. Next slide. And another click. These tensions impacted when and how society intervened. Up to the present day, child welfare policy and funding structures are designed to intervene after maltreatment has occurred. We heard Jerry talk about that quite a bit. The main function of child protection is to investigate allegations of abuse and neglect and to provide out-of-home care. That's the system we have. Overall, removals are equated with safety. Child maltreatment prevention efforts are primarily secondary or tertiary, and they rarely focus on primary prevention. Again, we're talking about a child rescue rather than a family support-oriented system. So are you beginning to see the need for a shift in our paradigm? What could the system look like if we focused on building strong, resilient families and communities, if our goal was to prevent children from harm before it happened, rather than responding after a child is abused or neglected? Next slide. Outcomes for children aging out of foster care are not good. And on top of that, it's expensive. It's expensive financially for society, and it's even more costly for children. Like that commercial says, the love and belonging to a family is priceless. Next slide. As we heard from Jerry Miller, it's clear that our current system of foster care intervention is not helping families and children, and we must change the way we engage. It's for these reasons that in February 2018, Congress passed and the President signed the Family First Prevention Services Act, known as Family First, as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act, a historic law that fundamentally changes our child welfare system. You can stay back. We're one slide ahead. So we want to start with our vision and our goals for children and families. Remember, we are suggesting a movement towards a paradigm shift, and thinking about system change and the implementation of Family First, it's important to start with your vision and goals. Here in Connecticut, Commissioner Durantes is leading DCF based on vision and goals. And Family First will be a tool to reach these goals. And I really want to underline that. We're spending this morning thinking about the implementation of Family First here in Connecticut, and it is a tool. It is not a magic bullet, but it's going to head us in the right direction. So slide 18, there we go. With the passage of Family First, Congress recognized the urgent need to change the way federal dollars can be used to strengthen families and prevent the unnecessary placement of children in foster care. This policy shift is aligned with what we know is best for children. Next slide. With the passage of Family First, Congress recognized the urgent need to change the way federal dollars can be used to strengthen families and prevent the unnecessary placement of children in foster care. This policy shift is aligned with what we know is best for children, and I get to say that twice. Next slide. Back one. So this shift, slide 12, is a shift from focusing federal dollars only on a child and only after removal from home toward a more family-centered policy that prioritizes the parent-child connection and the family unit. For the first time, the federal government will provide Title IV-E funding to both children and their parents. Birth parents, adopted parents, kinship caregivers, for prevention services. These services will help support a family and address their needs before there is a crisis and a child must be removed from their home. Next slide. So this new option for states and for tribes to claim Title IV-E funds for prevention activities is going to ensure appropriate placements in care and reauthorize numerous child welfare streams. This is a big bill. It's got lots of stuff packed into here, and we're going to be unpacking some pieces of it, but there are numerous pieces that are all attached to this prevention work. Next slide. So this is a very high-level look at some of the changes in the funding structure.
Good morning.
So before this federal law passed in 2018, most federal dollars are used for foster care. The child must be removed from their home and placed in out-of-home care to access the majority of federal funding. And those funds were used for services for the child. There's an income test that is based on a very old AFDC level of income, so that those dollars are rapidly diminishing. There was no support for a kinship navigator funding, and there was no financial support for a child to be placed with a parent in a residential treatment program. Under Family First, we now have federal dollars for prevention services. Those prevention services are for parents and children. There is no income test. So all of those, for those of you who've worked in public child welfare and known the hoops that you need to go to prove eligibility, there is no income test. There will be a 50% reimbursement for kinship navigator programs that are well supported and evidence-based. And there's 12 months of federal dollars now for children to be placed with their families in substance abuse treatment programs that are evidence-based and qualify. Next slide. Yeah. We should be on slide 15. Okay. I can have my things in the wrong order here. Okay, so this funding is going to allow states to have an open-ended entitlement for Title IV funds that meet the qualifications. So this is where one of the big pieces of promise is, and it's not tied to an income test. And so it's children who are at imminent risk of placement in foster care. So this is before they come into foster care or after they have gone back home. Eligible prevention services for mental health, substance abuse, and in-home parenting skills. Okay, now these services are going to need to be evidence-based and trauma-informed. And one of the other exciting pieces is that these services can be received for 12 months. So up to 12 months, it would be a service period. But then there is no limit on the number of 12-month services that a family can receive. So if a family came into a program, it was determined that they were at imminent risk of being placed in foster care, decided that, let's say, an in-home parenting service could be supportive to this family, and they were involved with the program for 6 months. And then 3 months later, they were starting to struggle again. They would still be eligible for the services. If they received those services for 12 months and they were still in need, they are then eligible for another 12 months of services. So it really is an open-ended system. Next slide. Okay, so once again, you're going to see these words, a child who is at imminent risk of placement. And one of my colleagues is going to dive into that and get under what is meant by that. A child who's exited to foster care, from foster care to adoption or back home with their family or for legal guardianship, all of these children could be considered at imminent risk. They could be in kinship placement with relative caregivers. Next slide. So these prevention services are in the categories of mental health, substance abuse prevention, and in-home parenting skills. One thing I'll point out, there was some confusion when the legislation first came out about what did we mean by in-home parenting services. That does not mean that they have to be in the home. It means that the child is living in the home with their caregiver. So those services may be a group service, they may be receiving them at an agency, but the in-home refers to where the child is living, not to where the service is delivered. The candidates or children in foster care who are pregnant or parenting are going to be eligible for services. And again, these are going to be evidence-based. Next slide. Now, what do we mean by evidence-based? Many of you in the room are providers, I believe, and are likely familiar with evidence-based services. But with Family First comes a new exciting opportunity to think about evidence-based services. How many of you are familiar with the California Clearinghouse for Evidence-Based Services? So a lot of you are. So when this came out, many of us, like me, thought, oh great, we've got this wonderful place that has identified evidence-based services for us. But we are dealing with the federal government, so they are not using any of the clearinghouses that currently exist. There is a new clearinghouse called the Federal Clearinghouse. And so the services that are going to be eligible to draw down these dollars are going to be on this new federal clearinghouse. But in familiar language, they are levels of evidence-based, with the lowest one being promising. So if a evidence-based service is judged to be at the promising level, they will go on the clearinghouse, and it may not be the same level that another clearinghouse uses to identify them, but we're going by how the federal clearinghouse does this. So they could be promises, supported, or well supported. And you can see, like in other ones, this has to do with the rigor of the studies that are done, the number of the studies that are done, the level of evidence that you're going to provide good outcomes for children and families. Next slide. So these again, will look fairly familiar if you're familiar with evidence-based services. Some of the keys to what makes something evidence-based is that they have to have a book or a manual. So we can't just say, well, we kind of do these things over here with families, and it seems to work out pretty well for them. No, it has to be a defined model in order for it to be replicable by somebody else. There has to be no empirical risk of harm. The weight of evidence suggests benefits. It must be reliable and have valid outcome measures, and no case data for severe or frequent risk of harm. So this, again, sounds pretty familiar, but it's just they're going to be rated on a different system for this new federal clearinghouse. Next slide. So here's the good news and the bad news. The good news is that the federal clearinghouse has been defined. It is up. Programs are beginning to be reviewed and put on. The bad news is these are the only ones that have been reviewed so far. So under the category of mental health, we have 4 different programs that have been reviewed and put into their categories on the clearinghouse. So 3 of those in the green are considered well supported. So at the highest level of evidence. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy only came in at the promising level in this clearinghouse. There's 3 under substance abuse, 3 all well supported under in-home skill-based, and neither one of the kinship navigator programs that have been reviewed met the criteria to be on the clearinghouse. So we have a very small pool at this point. Next slide. However, slowly, not as quickly as many of us would like this to be happening, other programs are being reviewed. So this is the list of the next programs that are up for review on the clearinghouse. Now, there's also another way that things are going to be able to be accessed for funding, and that is that the federal government has made a decision that because of the pace at which they are able to review things for the clearinghouse, they are allowing jurisdictions to also use a similar process and then submit them to the government with the proof of why they believe they should be on the clearinghouse. So hopefully that will speed things up a little bit. Next slide. That's the rest of the ones that will come up in the other categories. Okay, next slide. So what does that mean for us here in Connecticut? It does not mean that everything that goes on the clearinghouse needs to be used here in Connecticut. What it does mean is that Connecticut is going to need to decide which of those programs and services that are on the clearinghouse we would like to use here in Connecticut. Which ones do we believe will meet the needs of kids and families? And so out of those that the department, working along with the provider community and others, families, getting input from stakeholders, makes decisions about which of those we would like to use here in Connecticut. They will put them into a prevention plan that will be submitted to the government for approval. And so it's only the programs that go into your prevention plan that will be eligible to draw down federal dollars for. So these are some of the ways that we can look at and decide which are the right programs here in Connecticut. What kind of an assessment tool would we use to determine that? What's the culture and the system dynamics that it would take to implement an evidence-based program? Do we have a gap analysis? What are the needs? What do we already have? What might we need? So this is the process over the next, probably, I'll look at Michael and Deshonda, 6 months or so. The decisions will be made about which of the programs we want to use here in Connecticut. However, there's another piece of good news, which is this prevention plan that Connecticut will write and submit to the feds can be amended at any time. So if a decision is made a year from now that there are some other new exciting programs that we want to add, they can be done. You're not locked in. Next slide. So one of the other presenters, David, is going to be really diving into issues related to congregate care. But beginning October 2019, which is when you were first eligible to implement Family First, These are the categories that are going to be affected in terms of congregate care. In terms of placements. So a foster family home is still considered to be, obviously, an eligible placement. Facilities for pregnant and parenting youth. Supervised independent living for youth 18 years and older. Specialized placements for youth who are victims or at risk of becoming victims of sex trafficking. And family-based residential treatment facilities for substance abuse. These are all categories of placement that are addressed in Family First and related to being able to draw down funding. The one at the bottom there in red, a qualified residential treatment program, is probably the one that's getting the most buzz around as people think about what does that mean in the jurisdictions across the country, what are the needs it will meet for the children and the families here in Connecticut. So again, David is going to dive into that with you. Next slide. A few other items that are included in the Act. Again, we've mentioned kinship navigator programs, which currently do not receive funding, but could be eligible to receive up to a 50% reimbursement. Foster parent licensing standards. This was another thing that was addressed in the bill. Foster home model licensing standards were put forth by the feds, and each state, again, needs to go through those and decide how they will comply with those or why they won't comply with them. If there are things that are unique to your jurisdiction that says we're not in agreement with that licensing standard, the jurisdiction has the ability to make that decision. And residential treatment, as I've mentioned, it's going to allow for that family-based treatment under this. Next slide. There's also some court-related provisions in the Act. So there will be court oversight of group placements. The court is expected to participate in the statewide plan to prevent child abuse and neglect fatalities. It extended court improvement dollars through this Act. Training for court personnel, that's not new, but this Act again reauthorizes that. And it's providing some grants for the electronic data exchange for the interstate compacts. Next slide. So here is another piece of good news. All right. This has all been kind of overwhelming for people to take in. And when you dive into some of the funding pieces, it can really feel, again, quite overwhelming and confusing. One of those reasons is because that clearinghouse with well-supported, supported, and promising practices on it, the funding formula to be able to draw down federal dollars was set up so that 50% of the practices that you're using, the programs that you're implementing, had to be in the well-supported category. Others could be in promising or supported, but 50% had to be in well-supported. So if you did not have that 50% of well-supported programs, you couldn't access any federal funds at all for those prevention services. And remember, there was a very small list of programs that are eligible. So this was beginning to feel like a bit of a bind, and I'm very happy to say that our federal partners are recognizing this. So there is pending legislation currently on Capitol Hill. I'm very hopeful that it will pass, but it is pending at this point. That's going to phase in that need to have 50% well-supported. So this draft legislation would delay the requirement for 2 years, and then allow spending on both supported and well-supported programs to count toward the 50%. So over several years, you will eventually reach the point where 50% of the programs need to be in the well-supported category, but it's going to allow for some time for states to adjust and for the clearinghouse to grow. The next exciting piece of news is that they heard the fact that it takes money. It takes money to implement evidence-based programs, to build kinship navigator programs. All of these great pieces that could go a long way to supporting kids and families is going to involve some upfront funding. And so, happy to say that they are now, again, in this pending legislation, if it passes, it would provide states with a total of $500 million in one-time flexible funding. So there's a 3% set aside for tribes, and then there's a funding formula. So according to what I have read, Connecticut would be eligible for about $3 million if this legislation passed in flexible funding to help support the implementation of Family First. There's one other piece that's attached to this pending legislation. I'll share it with you. It's not because it would be useful here in Connecticut, but so you'll understand what's going on nationally, which is that there are numerous jurisdictions around the country that have been operating under a Title IV-E waiver. And so the transition from working under a 4E waiver to working under Family First was again making those jurisdictions quite nervous. There was going to be a gap as they moved from one way of accessing 4E dollars to another way of accessing 4E dollars. So under the same legislation, again, there would be some federal funding to help bridge that gap for those jurisdictions. Connecticut was not operating under a waiver, so we don't have to worry about that complexity, but it is part of this pending legislation. Which again, in my opinion, shows that the feds are recognizing some of the challenges along with the great benefits and opportunities that come with this act. Next slide. Oh, we got it. Okay, so what's going on around the country in relation to this? The opportunity started, the clock started in October of 2019. Connecticut is in the planning phase. And you may say, well, why were we not out the gate right away? Why did we not have this all ready to go? There are only 17 states across the country that have said, we would like to start implementing our use of Family First in 2019. Out of those 17, only 4 have submitted a prevention plan. And out of those 4, only 1 has been approved by the feds. So if anybody is wondering when you see 2019 and saying, why are we having our kickoff meeting at the end of 2019, you're in good keeping with the rest of the country who are taking a really thoughtful approach to say, we want a plan, we want to think about our evidence-based practice, we want to think about the system and the services that we currently have, we want to engage with our stakeholders, including the provider community, legislators, our courts, in thinking how are we going to make this work best here in Connecticut. And again, this is going on all across the country. As a national operating foundation focused on improving the child welfare system, needless to say, this has a lot of attention at Casey Family Programs. So what we are doing to help support this is really looking for opportunities to share the lessons learned as jurisdictions are moving forward. So back in the summer, for those 17 states that spoke up early and said, we want to implement, we want to be the early adopters of this, we convened them at an in-person convening to talk about what are the steps that they're taking, what are they thinking of about candidacy, how are they looking at their service array, what are their thoughts about how to shift their use of congregate care. And then the conversation was so rich, and there's so much work to do around this, that we have been sponsoring bi-weekly phone calls with these 17 jurisdictions. So every other week, there's a facilitated conversation with an opportunity for learning, sharing, presentations. It's been really well received, and so the rest of us were all saying, I, as a Casey employee, can listen in, but I'm like, what about my people in Connecticut? I want them to be able to listen in too. And again, the conversations have just been so rich and valuable that we have opened that up. And Connecticut was invited to join beginning in October. And so some members of your leadership team are able to be on that call and listen in to what's going on with those jurisdictions who are already out there making some of those decisions. What can we learn so we don't have to reinvent the wheel? I would urge you all, there is a website, familyfirstact.org, that is just a wonderful repository. Everything that you want to know and more about Family First. So it's archived, not exclusively by Casey Family Programs, but with many of the alphabet soup across the country, the ABA and CWLA and all the other organizations are contributing to this, so it's a repository. So whether you sit in the legislature and you're interested in what NCSL has to say about Family First, you can go there. If you're judicial, ABA's articles are on there. If you're a child welfare practitioner, Casey Family Programs and Annie and Casey Foundation's information, along with myriad others. The states are submitting all their information, so as prevention plans are being written, most jurisdictions are giving permission for those to go up on this site. So from whatever angle you sit at, great one-stop shop, instead of trying to just say, I've got to find the organization that I think has something that I want to know, you can find it all there. So I offer that up to you as a resource. And last slide, I want to remind you again, we're on our way. This is a shift. It's going to get us heading in the right direction with that wonderful word of hope that we can begin to change our system and focus on doing well by children and families and move much closer to a prevention strategy. Thank you very much.
Hold off on questions until we hear the other two components of this from our other two panel members. But Susan just gave us a very broad overview of what this looks like nationally. And next we have Miranda Lynch, who is a policy fellow at Chapin Hall from the University of Chicago, who will talk more specifically about the word candidacy, or candidacy for foster care.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I am here representing Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. We are a policy and research institute, and we work with public and private decision makers to apply evidence in a way that will help them improve the outcomes for children, youth, and families. So our primary area of expertise is child welfare, but we also work in supporting jurisdictions to address the needs of homeless youth and to address out of school time for children. Thank you. This word candidacy, I just want to, it's kind of federal bureaucratic speak. Really what we're talking about here is thinking about who to serve with this prevention services option, and how to get the right services to them at the right time to achieve the goal of preventing foster care and really preventing maltreatment. Chapin Hall has been working with several jurisdictions as they've been thinking about developing their prevention plan. Just an update, we're actually, I think, at 7 jurisdictions that have submitted a prevention plan, but still just DC that has been approved. And Chapin Hall has been working with DC, Maryland, and Kentucky, who are 3 of the 7 that have actually submitted a prevention plan so far. So I'm hoping that I'm sharing some of the insights of the process and the thinking that has gone into some of those discussions as they were developing their prevention plan. I would echo all of what you have heard already about this being a landmark piece of legislation. Prior to coming to Chapin Hall, I actually worked at the Children's Bureau for 20 years in their policy shop, and there has been so much conversation about how to rebalance the federal investment in child welfare. And to actually be at this point now where we see legislation that is attempting to do that is really something. It really took a lot of effort and many years to get to this place. And I think it's incumbent on us all to take advantage of the opportunity early, right? This in some way has been a gift, an experiment from the federal government. And I think if states really take advantage of it early and demonstrate, yes, we do want to invest in prevention. We do want to invest in supporting families. Perhaps there's the potential that you'll see more of those federal investments on the front end of the system in supporting families in the way that they need to be supported and not just in silos and in particular ways. So I'm going to focus on the prevention and EBP provisions and the opportunity for transformation within them. I say again that it's an opportunity. The prevention plan and prevention services is an option in the Family First legislation. And there are a number of choices that a state and its partners need to make to really take advantage of the transformational opportunities within it. It does require expansive thinking and strategic planning. It does require you to engage with the many partners that are here in this room and across communities in Connecticut to really leverage the law so that it can be transformational. So you've heard already that this option was first available October 1, 2019. We know that there's only one state right now that is approved to move forward with this aspect of the plan. And the prevention services and programs must be evidence-based again, and it's targeted towards two populations. Children at imminent risk of foster care, their parents and their caregivers, which is this candidates language that we're talking about, and pregnant and parenting teens in foster care. And we know that these services are really in three areas: parenting, skills, substance abuse treatment and prevention, and mental health treatment. So when we're talking about Family First, the headline is that this is directed towards prevention. And it is, but the legal frame is really around secondary and tertiary prevention, right? Meaning families that already have risk factors, families that may have already come to the attention of the Child Welfare Agency, just in the design of this language of children at imminent risk of foster care. But at the same time, the federal government has said very clearly to states, we're not going to define what candidates mean. We're not going to say who in your state, for your population, is at imminent risk of entering foster care. It's on you, state, to define who that population is, to justify it to us, the federal government, so that you can serve them with this new opportunity. Further, we know that there are more services that families need other than parenting skills, substance use, and mental health. So for states to be really transformational requires thinking beyond some of the limitations of this piece of legislation, right? And to really harness the energy and the conversation about how we support families as a whole and how we can use Family First as a tool within that. So more on this term, candidacy. So Family First does indicate one clear population that you can target your prevention services towards, right? And that is the pregnant and parenting young people in foster care. The idea there is that you want to improve and enhance their parental capacity so that they can care for their children outside of the system. But this other term of candidate or those at imminent risk of entering foster care is undefined, like I said. And what we've tried to help states think about is where they are on the continuum of defining a candidate or defining those at imminent risk of entering foster care. We've described it as a continuum of narrow, really thinking about those that you are already serving, those families where maltreatment is already indicated, you already have an open case and you're serving them in some way, up to a really broad definition that maybe identifies the community high-risk factors that may make somebody have the potential to come in contact with the child welfare system. From our experience in working with states and from looking at the prevention plan submitted to date, could you go back for a second? I would say that most states are in this medium, narrow to medium broad category. But again, we don't want that to define you and limit you. And many states have indicated that this is such a new program, it's such a new opportunity, that they want to throw their hat in the ring, so to speak, and figure out how to create a program that is going to work with them. But they may start small. And as Susan said, the state does have to come up with a plan for how to do all of this. But they can amend their plan with the federal government at any time. At any time. So at the point where you decide we're ready to move further upstream, we're ready to consider a broader population, we're ready to add more services to our plan, there is the opportunity to do that with the federal government. The other thing that we really want to make sure that states are thinking about is how they arrive at this decision of what a candidate is or what population to target with these services. We really encourage it to be a data-informed conversation, meaning make use of the administrative data that you have in your child welfare system, but don't just stop there. Lots of sister agencies have administrative data that suggests that kids may be at risk of coming into foster care because their families may lack the support that they need to protect them in the home or to ensure the right environment for them. So you want to bring together your partners in the juvenile justice agencies, with courts, with behavioral health, with early childhood, and get a more holistic picture of those families that may be at risk of entering foster care and that you want to keep them in their community so that that doesn't happen. When we say data informed, we also mean data information that's gathered from other sources. So your providers are a great source of information about what is really happening in the community with the families that they serve, what appear to be their needs, and what is the unmet need that they could identify in the community. And then actually talk to your communities, right? To talk with your families and other community representatives about what they understand to be the need and the opportunity here for transformation. I won't say a whole lot about this other than, like I said, there is this 5-year prevention plan that can be amended that the agency has to develop to be able to draw down the funding or the reimbursement for prevention services. One of the things that's fairly unique, there are a lot of federal plan requirements, but there are not many in legislation that articulate so clearly how to be strategic about providing a new service and a new program. So it's actually really encouraging to see that it helps you think about exploration, about installation, about sustainability, all within this plan. And so as you hear more about what will come next, there's an actual requirement in the law for you to think this through in coming up with your plan, but how Connecticut chooses to go about understanding the actual EVPs, defining your intended outcomes, your caseloads and your workforce that's going to support this. These are all choices that you need to make as you're thinking this through. The other thing that I will say is that even though this 5-year plan is something that the Child Welfare Agency will submit, a lot of the decisions that will be made in here do not necessarily implicate only the Child Welfare Agency. So there's nothing in the legislation around the prevention services option that says that it's the Child Welfare Agency that needs to identify families that are at imminent risk of entering foster care. Now, the Child Welfare Agency does have to figure out a way, if you decide to have some of your community service providers serve in that role, how to interact with them so that you can still be able to draw down the reimbursement But there are lots of opportunities and decisions to really rethink what your system looks like, because the legislation gives you that opportunity. So Susan already touched on the evidence-based programs that are a part of the clearinghouse right now. They are still kind of standing up their clearinghouse and their repository of services that are kind of pre-approved for states to select in their prevention plan. One of the things we want to highlight is that these interventions, nurse-family partnership versus PCIT, have very different target populations, right? So the thing that you may know about an EBP is that there is a defined population of families or children that it's intended to benefit. So you do need to have a good understanding about whether your families that are at risk of entering foster care tend to be those with younger children, tend to be because of behavioral health issues, or whatever the case may be, so that you can actually select the right EBPs for your prevention plan that aligns with what the population needs. But, I should say that we want, since you will already be engaged in the activity of identifying those families that are at risk of entering foster care and those that need additional family supports, don't limit yourself to thinking about this EBP list. It's a great opportunity to just think holistically. What do families need? Who are those families? How many are they? Where are they geographically across the state? Do they have particular cultural needs that we need to think about? And then see to what extent there's an EBP that lines up with them, whether that EBP is on the federal clearinghouse or not. Hopefully over time they will be. But wouldn't it be great if you as a state really identify what the needs are, what programs align with those needs, and can advocate for building the evidence for those programs to fit your family's needs. Plus, we also need to know that EBPs are not everything. Families need so many other services and supports that are not EBPs. And that's okay. It would be a terrible thing if what we draw from this is that we need to reorient child welfare or family support systems to really only be evidence-based. We're not there yet as a system where we can just select a whole constellation of services that are only evidence-based. But we do want to figure out where that fits into the constellation of what we're doing to support families. So, there are definitely some fiscal matters to attend to in understanding the opportunities that are here. Susan really highlighted that there is no income test associated with the federal reimbursement of funds for the prevention option. And because Title IV-E historically has been tied to that old AFDC standard from 1996. It's really crazy. About 38% of families nationwide that are engaged in child welfare met that standard. So to think that for this prevention services opportunity, a state can move from supporting about 40%, and I don't know if you guys know what it is for Connecticut specifically, it might be less than that, to 100% of families is really a big deal. And it definitely provides the opportunity to think about what are all your resources going into supporting families and your services, and if there's an opportunity now that you're drawing down federal funding for certain EBPs, that it frees up some other state funds to invest in other types of services that are going to reduce the need for foster care and keep children safely in their families. The federal reimbursement system is not a windfall, right? So there's no upfront investment from the federal government into prevention services. The state has to expend its own money and then can draw down half of the cost of the evidence-based services plus administrative and training dollars. And those are really important too. Just as important as the actual provision of service is how you're going to fund case management, your workforce, training them, your IT systems, all those ancillary supports that are needed to make the system function effectively, as well as the ongoing need for CQI to understand your outcomes, ongoing evaluations. Those are things that can be supported with this prevention services option. But again, it's not an upfront investment by the federal government, it is a reimbursement system. So it's incumbent on states to really do some fiscal analysis and to think this through carefully. There is a maintenance of effort provision in the law with the intention that this new prevention services Title 4E spending does not replace historical spending on prevention EBPs. But the way that the legislation is written is fairly narrow, and it ties that maintenance of effort to your 2016 spending on EBPs that are approved on the clearinghouse. So remember we were talking about how the clearinghouse really doesn't have many services approved right now? That actually works to your benefit in the maintenance of effort provision if you submit your prevention plan earlier, before there's a ton of programs on there. Particularly if you've already done a lot of investments in EBPs in this state, this can work to your advantage fiscally. Okay, I think I'll move on. So I gave you some of the technical requirements. I just wanted to make sure I really hit home about what some of the prevention opportunities are here. We've talked a lot about transforming the child welfare focus from foster care and investing in deep end and back end to prevention and increasing family stability and well-being. Investing in evidence-based interventions. Because there is this opportunity for states to do their own systematic review and kind of nominate programs to be on the clearinghouse, that's an opportunity for you to look around your state at services that you believe are effective and demonstrate that they are effective. Again, it requires some upfront investment. Once you get your 4E plan approved, then you can draw down federal funding so that you can finance the evaluations of programs that you believe to be evidence-based. But there's a clear opportunity there to say we value that there's evidence associated with some programs and we want to invest in that. Applying a trauma-responsive lens, Susan mentioned that the EBPs that are selected in the prevention plan have to be trauma-informed. The federal government doesn't actually define what that means, but it is an opportunity for you to define as a state what that means for you and to have a consistent understanding of what that means for your providers and your EBPs. Partnering across systems. I think that's why so many of you are in the room now, is because you want to be partners in supporting families. And what a great opportunity to say, there's actually some ways that we could draw down some additional federal funds in service of that. So there really is a way to work across the aisles, across your agencies, across your communities, and to engage them thoroughly in both identifying the problem, identifying the families that need to be served, and the best way to serve them. And then maximizing federal reimbursement here is just an obvious opportunity as well. So how do you go about trying to take advantage of all these opportunities? What we have been promoting in Chapin Hall is to not approach this legislation from the particular technical requirements, but to step back and think about what this means for you as a system and how to think about the different ways that you need to embed your desired transformation into your systems, right? Not just child welfare system, but all of your systems that are working in partnership. So to lead with your goals and outcomes in your desired transformation, to identify the partners that you need to engage to do that. To think about what needs to change in your practices, in your service array and policy. If you have this new value system or improved value system of supporting families, you can't do the same practices that you did previously if you're really trying to disrupt your system and come up with a different result. So you need to think holistically about how do we do assessments? Do we engage families well enough at our front door if we don't think that they're going to go into foster care? To really reevaluate what that looks like so that you can change what needs to be changed towards your desired outcome. Think about the data and evidence, not just what you have already to understand your population's needs and your services, but what you will need in the future to be able to track your success, to be able to celebrate that you have been able to prevent foster care and to prevent maltreatment. Administrative and fiscal opportunities. Again, thinking about where are there opportunities to blend and braid funding across funding streams in support of this goal. Make sure you have your Medicaid partners at the table, your early childhood partners at the table to help you think through these aspects as well. And your IT partners so that you can be sure to be capturing the right information going forward. Implementation capacity and strategy is really about how the nuts and bolts of how you're going to do this and with your workforce, right? Really thinking about change management and what are the values of your workforce and partners and providers that all bring to the table that you may need to align in a different way as you're moving forward. And then really just thinking about, what's pressing for Connecticut? What are some other opportunities to connect this family first work to a larger vision or larger opportunities so that you're not talking about family first as the thing, but you're focusing on what the opportunities are for your children and families collectively. So I wanted to just touch on one example. We've referenced the District of Columbia, which submitted its prevention plan to the Children's Bureau in May and received approval just a couple of weeks ago. Prior to Family First legislation, DC was already pretty invested in community-based approaches to serving families. They had collaborative agencies in the community that served families that did not need the higher level intervention of their child welfare agency or were serving families after they had had some child welfare intervention and were back in their families and needing support. DC has really conceptualized who they want to serve, not just through Family First, but who they want to serve as an agency so that they can support families. And they've described their populations as in the front yard, at the front porch, or at the front door. So when we're talking about in the front yard, we're talking about those that are out in the community. They don't necessarily have any child welfare involvement, but they may have some needs for them to be able to thrive as a family. Your front porch are those that have come to the attention of the agency in some way, but can remain in their families with some additional supports. And those that are at your front door, those that are really engaged in open cases or in foster care right now, or may have just exited back into the community. So the District of Columbia took a look at all of their data in coming up with their prevention plan. And they really wanted to push the envelope in terms of serving those families in the front yard. And I think where they arrived at in their prevention plan at the outset is not being able to serve them through Family First, the legislation, being able to focus more on the populations that have had some child welfare involvement already. But because they identified such a great need of families out in the front yard, they made the case for a citywide initiative, confusingly called DC Families First, that is going to address more primary prevention. Go to the next slide, yes. So this intervention is more in line with what Jerry was talking about at the outset, right? Of thinking about who you want to be as an agency, as a city, as a state, and how you want to serve families, and crafting ways to serve them that uses Family First as a small tool within that, but then looking across your partners to serve the larger population. So they've created an initiative that is still being stood up, where they are going to have 10 neighborhood-based centers, success centers, and each center will have a slightly different approach. They'll get to do their own needs assessment of their communities and figure out what the right constellation of services and supports may look like, talking about concrete services and supportive services in the community. Now they know that they can't use Family First, the legislation, to fund that work, but they have clear evidence that there's a need, that they were able to get their mayor to subscribe to and promote to have this more primary prevention focused opportunity. You probably cannot see this. It is the theory of change that the District of Columbia laid out in their prevention services plan. Just a couple of things I wanted to highlight here is that they clearly brought in both their child welfare agency, other city agencies, including the mayor's office, as key partners and key supports to making the prevention plan work. They built that right into their prevention plan and their theory of change. And then their ultimate goal, their distal outcome, what they really want to achieve is a child welfare system that is rebalanced so that it's primarily preventative and a family strengthening system. So the opportunity here for Connecticut is to really think about what is the right approach for you. And so it's exciting to think that you're going to be on that journey to work with your partners in your communities to figure out where you sit in terms of candidacy and figuring out the population for your prevention plan specifically, and what other opportunities there are to support families as a whole. Thank you.
And there's also a piece of Miranda that's a little bit modest. She actually helped to orchestrate and usher the District of Columbia's prevention plan, and the only plan that has been accepted by the feds right now. So we're happy to have her kind of help us talk through that. Also, too, I hope what's starting to happen as we hear different components of this is we think about things that we have already been underway in Connecticut doing over the last several years to position us primely for changes in our system. The last piece of this that we're going to talk through from the members of our panel is with David Collins and opportunities for congregate care. So think about how far we've come as a system in Connecticut, with less than 10% of our children in congregate settings. That's actually 7%, which is the most recent when we think about across our state where we are right now. David is the Chief Program Officer for the Children's Village in New York, and he's going to talk about specifically opportunities for congregate care providers as we think about Families First and Prevention Services Act.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for that kind introduction, Commissioner, and thanks for having me. So you've got my bio, you've heard where I'm from. I'll talk about what we do at Children's Village in a minute, but one of the most important things in my experience that brings me here today is that I started my career as a child care worker in a residential treatment setting. Has anybody else in this room ever been a child care worker? All right. Does anybody here still spend most of your time in the child care setting? All right, good. We need you. Glad you're here. So talking about changes to residential care, I think, we're doing a lot of things beyond residential care, and it's great to hear that Connecticut has such a small number of kids in residential care. It's always interesting to be a residential provider, talking about how great it is to have very few kids in residential care, but that's how we really feel. And that's because we do a lot of things other than residential care today. But I think having that base of having been there and knowing what goes into doing residential care is also really important. Thank you. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to try to kind of balance between giving you an overview of QRTP and the requirements in the legislation and talking about our own experience. And I'm going to try to do it pretty quickly so that we have time for some discussion. Here's our mission. Got to put the mission up. And as with any agency, when we kind of reflect on, we're always kind of like thinking about, okay, what does this actually mean? And for us, what we find ourselves talking about lately a lot is that really relationships heal. Relationships for our kids are part of what allow us to do the things that we reference here. And you heard Commissioner Milner in the video talk about all of the disruptions and all of the things that sever relationships that happen to kids in the system today. And really, our kids need the same opportunities that we would want for our own children, or that we do want for our own children, for those of us that have them. They need unconditional love and belonging. They need access to not just, permanency and permanent families, that's the beginning, but they also need access to good schools, to safe and beautiful environments, to places that are accommodating to them and that really give them a chance to thrive. And so that's what we're going to talk about. You heard Susan's overview of the history of child welfare. It's a wonderful background. Thank you for that. So when we talk about the history of how we dealt with poor families in the United States, the Children's Village was one of those agencies that was around. And that's one of the funny things about working in New York City is a lot of the agencies are older than the system itself. So we were founded in 1851 as a Protestant charity. We were part of the orphan train movement. We were one of those very early sectarian charities that was involved in family separation 160 years ago. So that's a history that we have to talk about and reckon with. We have a large residential campus in Dobbs Ferry, which is in Lower Westchester, just outside New York City. And we do a mix of child welfare, juvenile justice, and services for unaccompanied immigrant children. We were, even as recently as 2004, when our current CEO arrived, we were 90% residential. And we've shifted from that point to now being only about 40% residential, and we have a commitment to a broad range of community-based services. So some of the changes that Families First is kind of anticipating are things that we've already gone through, or things that they're encouraging us to do, or things that we've done. And that's not because we're so smart and ahead of the game. It's partially because, frankly, we were in crisis. Our old way wasn't working. We were a 90% residential agency, and our intake was closed with our largest placing agency. So that required some reflection and some change. And we also happen to be in a jurisdiction that has made a lot of those progressive changes. And so we've had support from government oversight and from our funders, and we had that internal impetus for change based on what was happening prior to our CEO's arrival. So it's not that we're ahead of the curve, it's just that we found ourselves in this set of circumstances and we've done our best to respond. And our strategic plan does include a commitment to implementing EDPs whenever possible. I think, you've heard Miranda talked a bunch about this. I think access to evidence-based practice is really unequal across our sector right now. And for large agencies like us, we have had the opportunity to make those investments. Not everybody has. And so Families First is pushing us towards making those investments more often. I think we really have to think about how we make EBPs accessible to everybody. And we also if you hear people in the implementation science field, they talk about practice-based evidence. So in other words, not just using those lab-grown EVPs, which we use them, we believe in them, but also developing evidence for the efficacy of some of those community-based solutions, solutions that are the closest to the problem. So I think I'm looking forward to trying to work on that in the next couple of years. Thank you. So context, we supported and advocated for Families First. Just put that right on the table. There's a diversity of perspectives on Families First in the provider community. We believe it's necessary and important. But we also understand that, we're a big agency, and we already do a lot of different things. So we know that what works for us is not going to work for everybody. And I don't want to come in here and say, this is what we do, you guys should just do that. If it turns out that that works for you, great, but that's not the posture here. But we're sharing it because change is possible, transformation is possible. So regardless of where you're at with your organization or with where you're at in the system, we do think that if we're bold and if we're committed to it, that change can happen. I know that like one of the complications, or not complications, but one of the differences between Connecticut and New York is that there's a pretty heavy use of group homes here, which is quite different. In New York City, we actually have a lot fewer group homes and a lot more kind of large residential providers like us. So that's a difference that we have to consider and reckon with. This next piece, again, this is really well set up by Jerry's remarks and by the history that we heard. But we can't talk about this without talking about social injustice and structural racism. We can't. It just doesn't make sense. And we have a 1 hour orientation that we do for it's a 2-week orientation, but the 1 hour of that for everybody that comes into Children's Village talks about the history of our system and a lot of the history that you just heard today. And talks about the Children's Village's role in that history. Our CEO talks about how historically the kids who come into our system are the least valued in our society, or the ones that society stigmatizes for various reasons. And still to this, so I talked about how we were part of the orphan train movement. We were part of family separation when we were talking about separating immigrant, largely Irish and Catholic kids, and placing them with Protestant families. And we've been part of this conversation ever since. Still to this day, 98% of the kids in foster care in New York City are children of color. 98%. And still to this day, when I get in a room with the executives and the leaders in New York City, much like this room, it is not 98% people of color. And so that's also something that we have to reckon with. So we don't say this to depress or demoralize, but we say it because if change is possible, we're going to have to reckon, frankly, with the history and with the present. This point about federal policy changes abroad, and you heard from Miranda about how much flexibility jurisdictions have in setting up their own plans and defining their target populations and their, what their theory of change is going to be. So really, the implementation is going to be at the local level, and that's why, I commend everybody for being here in this room and for beginning that process. And that's why I say that the worst implementation plan would be to merely comply. And what I mean by that is that if we look at this as just, we need to find a way to keep doing what we already do. We don't really want to change. We got to kind of like work around these new procedural requirements. You're adding more regulatory obligations to a system that's already strained, right? You're really going to make it harder on everybody, and it's not going to get any better. So change is hard. There's going to be compromise. There's going to be problems, but I think just complying with the law would be a big mistake, and that's a conversation that we're having in New York as well. So here, you've already heard the overview here, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but these two last points are what we're going to talk about a lot here. So federal support for group care placements is limited to these specified settings, and placements in QRTPs also require an independent assessment and family court approval in order to justify. So what that means, if you're a residential provider, is that if you're not one of those other specified settings, if you're not a SILP or an anti-trafficking or a maternity placement, you pretty much need to be a QRTP. And what it also means, and this is, we're not going to talk about this a lot today, but I think it's really important, providers and jurisdictions will need a process for determining the appropriateness of placement in order to draw down those $40. So that's a hyper-local issue. I'm not that familiar with Connecticut, so I won't presume to talk to you about how to do this. But in New York, we're focusing a lot on the need for resources in family court to make this happen. Because I think one of the worst things that we can do is find ourselves in like an adversarial litigation around routine level of care decisions, which is something that can happen anyway in family court, depending on the council and the parties and the judge, but I think to the greatest extent possible, these are social work decisions, these are public agency decisions, and we need to set up a process that allows us to succeed at that while also keeping the courts informed about what we want to do and meeting the mandates in the law. So this is what goes into a qualified residential treatment program. You have to have on-site clinical services appropriate to the treatment setting, including 24-hour backup coverage. You have to be licensed and accredited. You have to have a trauma-informed treatment model. You have to facilitate and document family involvement, maintain sibling connections, and provide at least 6 months of post-discharge support. So the good news is that most of these are things that if you're a residential provider, you already do or you already want to do, and you're trying to do to some extent. And so I think the conversation now under Families First is really for jurisdictions to think about how do our funding models align or not align with these principles? How do they support what we're asking residential providers to do under the law, and are there any changes that we need to make? So like aftercare and medical services are probably two of the biggest examples where in some places the funding model may have to change or the provider model may have to change if it's not aligned with this. Next slide, thank you. Here's just a really quick overview of how how Children's Village, is complying with the QRTP requirements. We are fortunate to have a 24-hour full-service medical clinic on site. We have behavioral services on site, and that's we're able to do that based on our scale and based on the different populations that we serve. We're accredited by COA. I know there's different options out there. I think for most agencies that are not super hospital-like, COA is the best option. We'd be happy to talk about that afterwards. Our treatment model is called the integrated treatment model, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Family involvement and sibling connections and discharge support. The main thing I want to emphasize about this is it's not one strategy. We actually have a variety of programs in both of these categories because this part of the work is not a monolith. There's really a lot of different kind of nuances to how we do this with different populations and with different case circumstances. So we do use the family finding model. We have a parent council, which is comprised of parents whose kids have been in the system with us. And we have parent advocates inside the agency as well, which we'll talk about. Let's go ahead. So a little bit about that history that I referred to. So in the early 20th century, when we relocated to Dobbs Ferry, we were the pioneers of the residential treatment approach. We were one of the first agencies to have psychiatric care of kids in our residential setting. And by 2002, we were still a predominantly residential agency, and we had very high length of stay. And the dominant view of kids was that pathologized view that we talked about before, that stigmatizing view. And so we really, even as late as 2002, it was not unusual for kids to spend 3 to 5 years at our program. And then, as I said, due to a variety of factors, including good leadership, but also including really some external push, we began to change our stripes. And we shifted our focus to the idea that children do best as part of a loving, permanent family. A lot of our failures as a system, and you heard Jerry talk about this, have to do with our unwillingness to help parents in order to help kids, and our judgments about families and what they're going to do with that help, or what their motivations or capabilities are. And making this change doesn't mean that we flipped a switch and our kids don't have challenges anymore, right? It's not like in 2002 the kids were really tough, and in 2004 now it's easy. Of course not. But you can't change without changing the thinking first, right? And so the change was really from talking about bad kids or troubled kids to kids to whom bad things have happened. And I think that's a frame that is now pretty well understood in our field, but it really wasn't back then. So we really think about residential as an emergency room, and not only do we need to be diversified from doing just residential, but also the other things that we do need to be connected in a continuum that allows kids to move out of residential in a planful way, in a way that's supported, in a way that's not abrupt. We're not just reducing residential for the sake of reducing it. We're doing it in a way that kids are going to have their needs met in a less restrictive setting. So just a couple of kind of descriptions of how we've gone about doing that. As I mentioned, our parent council was founded in 2004, and we began hiring paid parent advocates in 2005 with a grant, with a local grant in New York City. And that, I was in our foster care program around then, and there was some tension when we did that. There was that, has anybody here worked with parent advocates inside their agency? Yeah, so it's good. There's some healthy tension that comes from that, right? Because having a parent advocate who's really vocal, who has lived experience in the system, will quickly remind you of how little we listen to parents when they're not in the room, and how often we're having conversations at our agencies when parents are not in the room. And so our CEO told me at that time, you have to embrace this tension, because this is the problem with our system, is that these conversations aren't happening anywhere except maybe sometimes in family court, and even then, the process is really tilted away from the families. So that's been a really important change, and the best way to incorporate family voice is to literally incorporate family voice, to have them in the room. We have an aftercare program, the WAY program, which is 35 years old at this point, and for the first 28 years of that, it was 100% privately funded. So when we talk about in Families First, the requirement for universal aftercare in residential, we're very well aware of how against the norm that is. But we finally, after many years, began to attract some public support for the WAY program, and we now still cover most of the cost privately. We believe that aftercare, 6 months is really good. It's a good start. We know that, especially for kids that have spent a long time in the system, it's often much longer than that they need support. That adolescence really continues well into what we consider early adulthood. So we offer 1 year of aftercare case management, and we have a voluntary mentoring program that will stay with kids for up to 5 years. And some of them do take advantage of that. I was at our Harlem building this Saturday, and we have Wrap It Up Saturdays once a month, where all of our mentor kids come in and meet and have a meal and get together. And we had a room full of kids, many of whom had left Children's Village before I was a director, who are still coming back to that group and sharing. We've implemented Kevin Campbell's family finding model, and when we were first starting out in residential, kind of in that move from residential to families, a lot of that was about adoptive recruitment, because we had a lot of kids who'd stayed in the system for a really long time, and so their goal was adoption. And thankfully, that's no longer the case. Now, actually, a lot of the time when we're doing family finding, we're looking for step-down resources, we're looking for permanent adult connections, we're even sometimes just looking for visiting resources. So one of the things that makes family finding really good is just that even if it doesn't result in a placement resource, it results in kids being less lonely. It results in kids having that one unconditional belonging relationship that they need to succeed. We also have partnerships with credible messengers. So the same way we talk about having parent advocates in the room and having parent voice in the room, we have youth voice in the room. We have the Bravehearts in Westchester County, which is they were recognized by CWA last year as a Blueprints for Excellence model. It's an entirely youth-led organization for people who've been in contact with foster care and juvenile justice. And so they're embedded in our programs, and they provide a lot of really important insight to us about what we ought to be doing. And we've also worked to integrate our programs with community behavioral health support and care management programs. And we really think that affordable housing is the next major barrier, and we've done some work. All right, I'm preaching to the choir. I'm not going to say anything else about that. But we've just opened a building in Harlem that has 9 floors of permanently, deeply affordable housing to members of the community, and 2 of those floors are for kids who have left the foster care system. And so we're doing that as proof of concept that this stuff can be done and that it can be part of the continuum for kids leaving the system. I'm going to spend the last few minutes just talking briefly about our treatment model in residential, because although we do need to reduce residential and all the stuff that we just talked about, when we are doing residential, we need to do it really well. And if you've spent any time in residential care, you've been through a lot of different initiatives and models, right? It's like it just comes with the territory. Every year or two, we're changing our stripes or changing, what our treatment approach is, or we're incorporating a new approach. Children's Village previously described its treatment approach as eclectic, which I think is a nice way of saying we didn't have a really clear idea of what we were doing. So now we do. I've been through a lot of these models, and I got to tell you, I'm a big believer in the integrated treatment model. It's developed by Dr. Eric Trupin out of the University of Washington. I believe there is one juvenile justice program in Connecticut that's using a version of this, actually. So there is some local implementation. And what I love about the ITM is that the youth care staff and the frontline staff play a really critical role in treatment. So it's very DBT heavy. It's focused on teaching dialectical behavioral therapy skills. If you're familiar with DBT, you know that it was developed originally for people with borderline personality disorder. It's an adaptation of CBT, and the developer, Marshall Linehan, observed that a lot of the people she was treating were coming from profoundly invalidating environments as children, and that led to some of their challenges as adults. So I can't think of a more profoundly invalidating environment than your typical foster care setting. So we find that DBT is really broadly applicable to our kids and really works really well in terms of changing the conversation around treatment. So we do twice weekly skills groups. We prioritize our treatment plans around the most important behaviors that we see. So kids can come in and they can have this laundry list of stuff that somebody put on their treatment plan. But we really try to put that in tiers around the most important pieces. So the top tier would be any violence, any self-harm, running away, safety issues. Then your second tier behaviors would be like treatment interfering behaviors, things that are preventing you from addressing the things you need to address. And then third tier would be quality of life interfering behaviors. And we use behavior chain analysis, which is a core part of DBT. One of the classic errors, one of the other classic errors of residential is that we used to do a really good job of changing kids' behavior in placement. And they would get really good at following the rules in the cottage and not, we would do nothing to prepare them to go back to their community. We wouldn't prepare their family and we wouldn't prepare them, and they'd go back, and what do you think would happen? So we do an adaptation of multi-systemic therapy called MST FIT, Family Integrated Transitions, that's specifically designed for aftercare for kids reintegrating from residential. Actually Children's Village did one of the first MST aftercare pilots in New York almost 20 years ago. And it was a pretty big failure. And it was one of our first implementations of MST. And MST, the evidence for it was really as a front door prevention. And so we had tried to use it as aftercare, and it really wasn't set up for that. And so FIT is an adaptation that really better positions MST to work with the reintegration with the family, which I think is significant. Any MST practitioner will tell you that working with a kid who's already been separated from their family presents some additional clinical challenges for sure. So we also have internal model consultants who provide training and consultation and incorporate feedback. We have implementation teams that include everybody from child care workers up to our chief program officer. And we have what we would like to think is some pretty rigorous adherence. And that's, just real quick, next slide please. Okay, so we measure the skills groups, we measure the environment. We track incidents, we track participation in training, we look at the treatment plans to see whether they're progressing through those tier 1, 2, 3 behaviors, whether behaviors are getting less severe. And then we have, if you know MST, you know that MST has the gold standard in terms of fidelity, so we get access to that for the aftercare phase. And that's our story. Thank you.
So thank you, David. Now, we've heard a lot of information here, and we expect that you're going to leave here with more questions and answers. Sorry about that. That you will leave here with more questions than answers, but that's the beauty of being able to have a year in our planning. So we want to take a few minutes right now to ask some of your hear some of your high-cut questions for our panel members before we then solidify what the ask is here as we start to develop Connecticut's approach. So you want to take some microphones out there?
Sure.
My question is for David. Can you talk a little bit about what the difference is between residential and a group home in the state of New York?
Sure. In New York, the cutoff is 12 beds for an agency-operated boarding home versus what they call institutional setting. So, and it's also, like, we have cottages on our campus. We're a large campus with a number of cottages, so that some of those individual cottages have less than 12 beds, but because it's a campus setting, that's all considered one. That's residential. That's institution, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the great presentations. My question has to do with the payer of last resort issue with evidence-based practice. Connecticut is well positioned from the standpoint of having a long history of implementing EBPs, but perhaps disadvantaged by the fact that we're implementing a lot of EBPs from the standpoint of investment of new dollars to access the federal reimbursement. So I wonder if you have any advice for Connecticut in that area.
Before we answer that, I do want to acknowledge Jeff and Allison. Both Jeff Vanderploeg and Allison Blake have kind of started to look at the data baseline for Connecticut and have pulled together some research to help us think about what our data is already telling us and how we can think about our service array in different ways. So thank you for joining us today and being a part of the early discussions about where Connecticut is positioned and where we can go as it relates to this. So just a moment of patience.
Yeah, sure.
Hello, I have a question about the...
Hold on, time out.
I'm sorry.
You wanna answer
Yep.
that? Hold on a second.
Yeah, this is a very sticky issue. So essentially what it means is that the Title IV-E prevention services reimbursement from the federal government is the last payer, right? So if you are supporting an EBP with Medicaid or with some other, there's a number of federal funds, they have to continue to pay. You can't switch your funding streams, and that interacts with the 50% requirement where you have to spend, half of your state expenditures at the well-supported level. Many of those well-supported programs that are approved by the clearinghouse are Medicaid funded. So, I don't have great advice here. This is a really sticky issue. It's one that a number of states have engaged the federal government on, and there's just no room. So maybe if we have the 50% legislative fix, that will help us some, but eventually we're going to be in this position again. And states, it doesn't make sense to not support via Medicaid an EBP. It's a larger population of families that you would be serving, right? So you don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul. So you really do have to do some careful analysis, really look at the specific EBPs, how you're currently funding it. The opportunity that exists is if Medicaid is paying for the service, you can still draw down Title IV-E funding for the case management, the administrative costs, the training, right? So there's still some opportunity there, even if it's the Title IV-E funds are not supporting the service per se. Okay.
My question, and excuse me for the interruption before, my question is, will Connecticut have a process to officially approve an agency or a program as a QRTP once the agency feels they have met all the qualifications? Will there be some kind of approval process?
Yes. What you'll hear in the final presentation today is just the nuts and bolts about how we begin to craft just that.
Thank you.
Good morning. This is a lot of conversation about what we're going to do for families. How do you plan to fully employ families in this process so that it's something that we do with them in lockstep and not to them or for them?
Yep. So today, before we all leave, we will be setting up specific groups to talk about each component of this, and we expect to have family stakeholder representation on all of those groups. Joshanda will be up here in a few minutes to talk about what those groups look like and what the actual layout of our thinking is about that, but there's definitely not only a seat at the table, several seats at the table for parents and stakeholders to participate in the development of Connecticut's plan.
Hi, I have a question for Miranda, I guess as a follow-up. So separate from Medicaid, right, thinking about other federal funding streams, so MCV funding, right, the federal funding for maternal home visiting, in many states is the funder or the payer for some of the evidence-based home visiting models, which show a lot of promise, not promise on the clearinghouse, which is promise for all of us, right? So I guess what I'm wondering is, could a jurisdiction, could a state like Connecticut expand the number of families being served by one of the evidence-based home visiting models using state dollars that they could then seek reimbursement for, right? So not trying to supplant the MICV, but just to be able to expand their reach using that model.
So I have to admit that I don't think I know the answer to that question. Just because I am not entirely clear how all the funding streams work, right? So what the requirements are that go along with MICV and kind of how state match works for any of those programs. So I don't know that I can answer that fully. It's definitely something to explore. Thanks, Allison.
Thank you very much for coordinating this and bringing us all together. I am interested in hearing how both DCF, DDF, DSS, DDS, DMIS, and OEC and DOJ, of course, are going to be having input into the Families First initiative of our state.
So this has started with our Child and Family Services Plan, which is the plan that we submit every so many years to the federal government about how states think about a collective approach to the work that we do. And we started that by sitting at the table with other commissioners of other state agencies to just think about that. How do we, across lines, start to consider our Child and Family Services Plan beyond and much more broadly than just the DCF agency. And so we were very successful at having several other commissioners and state agencies sign on to our Child and Family Services Plan, which was approved, separate from our prevention plan that you heard talk about, but really thinking about how we form our system to think differently. And it was a different type of report that we pulled together than it had been in years past. It was more about thinking, how can we think about this in a much more broader context? And there are several representatives from other agencies here, some traditional, like DMIS, DDS, OEC, and then some not so traditional. The DMV is here. You know, how do we think about housing differently? How do we think about some of our other state agencies in a way that really puts a much more broad emphasis on the child welfare system as opposed to the child welfare agency? And a lot of eagerness we saw at the statewide SAC retreat of other state agencies that kind of came together to say, what do we need and how can we all help kind of move all of this along in terms of our transformation. So I do think that we're out of the gate in a really solid place. Other high-cut questions or comments that you had from what you've heard so far? Okay, as we continue to process all of this, I'd like to invite Rashonda Guerrier. If you haven't met her yet, she is our administrator for clinical and community consultation at DCF, and she will come and talk to you about Connecticut's approach to really thinking about our timeline and what the ask is of today's presentation. Thank you to our panel. They're still going to be here to answer questions for us, but thank you to them for really breaking down the components of this in a way that we can understand.
Good morning. So thank you, Commissioner, for that, and I have to echo, thank you for what the panel has provided for us this morning, because it's been a lot of information that has resolved, hopefully, some of your burning questions, but we know as we go through this process, you all will have many more. As the Commissioner indicated, I am the current administrator for clinical and community services, but for today's purpose, I'm one of two co-leads that will be facilitating this effort for the state of Connecticut. You all saw Mr. Ken Meisenglen earlier this morning when he came up, but Ken and I will be the two individuals that will be responsible for plotting our path forward. So we're here today just to kind of talk about what's next. Great information, it all means a lot. I think everybody may agree that we really have to get our arms around how we're going to do this as a state. And what we're going to do in terms of a planning cycle is, some of you may react to this slide that you probably can't see, as June 2020, that's pretty much right around the corner. We're currently sitting in November, and we recognize that this is ambitious, but at the same time, we want to be very intentional in the work that we do. We want to be very focused in the conversations that we have. We really want to be structured in our process. And so what this is kind of depicting for you is a planning cycle around, we're in November right now. We're going to get to a slide a little bit later in the presentation that tells you how to get involved. Many of you have already raised questions about what about us as providers, what about us as parents, as stakeholders. There will be great opportunities, but what we're envisioning is that in the next couple of weeks, you guys will let us know if you're interested. We're going to then go through all of that information and stand up these work groups tentatively. We are looking to stand those up the first week in December, but we know that we're a little bit at a disadvantage because we need to select leads. And so we did not want to be presumptuous in identifying who those leads were before we had this conversation with you guys as stakeholders of the community at large, because not only do we want to lead this effort as DCFers, but we also want to leave it lockstep with you. So what you guys will come to learn is that we're going to stand it up with an external and an internal. So a community person will be at the table when we talk about leads. And so we will very quickly determine who those individuals are. And then you'll see December, January, February, March. There will be a lot of work that's going to be required of all of us as we have those conversations to be intentional. Miranda gave us some good information with regards to thinking through the larger picture, and David also touched on not just being compliant with the law, but thinking about what does this mean for Connecticut. Great questions in the room already when you think about the strides that you guys have already done with regards to EBTs and really wrapping our brains around how do we get there and how do we make good decisions for our state. From a time commitment standpoint, we're thinking that December through March window will be a 1 to 2 meeting a month. Some groups may really roll your sleeves up and realize that you maybe need to meet a little more frequently than 2 times a month. But we really need to think through it, do documentation, because ultimately whatever the work groups put together, and you'll hear me talk about the 5 work groups here in a minute, what they put together will feed the larger state plan. So that work will happen across 3 or 4 months. But by March, no later than April 1st, ideally, each of the 5 work groups would have fed that information up to our governance committee that we need to establish. The governance committee will be responsible for advisory oversight and leadership. And so as you guys kind of get blocked or stuck or need to ask questions about where are we as a state, we will have a governance body that will help the communication flow. And so that report in April, once they get the information from all of you all, they will spend a great deal of time trying to craft the overarching state plan that was fed by all of the information that the various work groups are going to stand up. And then, as you know, with any bureaucracy, there's approvals that must occur, which is why we need to, of course, route it for governor office approval. But our goal, guys, is to get our Connecticut finalized plan submitted to the feds by June 30th at the latest. And the reason for that is because we are trying to go live October of 2020. You all have already heard that there was an option to go sooner. But we're delaying and we want to get there. And so you may be compelled to exhale by the time we get to June. But the reality is the work will not be over. We will spend the summer going back and forth, most likely with our federal partners, answering any questions that they may have about anything that we have built into our plan. I think you heard Susan talk about many people were very robust and eager and said, we want to be first. There were about 17, if I recall correctly from her presentation. And of those 17, we have how many approved plans? 1. So as you all know, despite our eagerness to get there, we will still have some work to do if we want to meet our target of October of next year. So when you hear me talk about these work groups, some of you may be wondering, well, what are they? We have 5 that we've identified, and you've heard the commissioner touch on our Child and Family Services Plan was the impetus to the work. So when we looked at all of that work that you all have already put together as a state to determine where we need to focus our energy and our attention to be able to drive Connecticut's prevention plan, we thought for starters, we would touch on candidacy, permanency and service array, kinship and foster care, fiscal revenue enhancement, and then community partnership and family-child engagement. So I know that's a lot of words, and so for some of you all, you may be saying, well, what does that mean? When you think about candidacy, our presenter today, Ms. Miranda Lynch, did an excellent job of explaining to you all that from a candidacy standpoint, we can be in that very restrictive range, we can be in that very broad, or we can be moderate to broad. So we have to think about what's best for us as a system. So individuals who join this group, what you're going to be doing is developing Connecticut's definition for candidacy for the purposes of Family First. What is that eligible population of youth that we would be able to then request our 50% federal reimbursement claiming for? So that's what that group will be tasked with. And so when you really start to think about what does that mean across systems, someone in the back of the room asked the question about how do we get all of our sister agencies engaged and involved? That's where you're going to have that conversation about what is our eligible population? Do we want to be like DC and talk about the kids that's in the front yard? Or do we want to be like other states that's very focused on high-risk populations only? So that's a discussion that is very important. It may seem easy, but the reality is those tasks with this definition, understand that it drives everything else that we do in all of the other work groups, because that's the anchor. That's how you then go into your services and programs group to really think about how does those services that we select map back to the children that we have identified as our eligible candidacy population. So that's going to be very, very key. I know in Connecticut you guys have spent a great deal of time really refining your intervention strategies and really looking at evidence practices. But now I think it's time to take a step back from that to really look at, yes, it's great that we fund those, but are they quality services? Are they the right services that map to our identified population of youth that we serve in our state? And so those will be some tough conversations, because I know that folks are passionate about their models, they're passionate about their services that they provide to their youth, but at the end of the day, we have to look at need versus availability, costs, the reimbursement structures, and then you guys heard earlier that daunting information with regards to the Fed's clearinghouse. So there's great hurdles to jump there, but there's also opportunities, especially if we get creative in this group and leverage the ability to be able to put forth some programs that we think should be rated, and that we want to actually roll up our sleeves and do the work around making recommendations to the feds. We can maybe help expedite that process. So if you're thinking about if this is the group for me, think about your knowledge around evidence-based practices. Maybe you have something to lend. Are you currently an intervention provider? Do you understand prevention? Because a lot of times people confuse primary versus secondary versus tertiary, what it is not, and how all of those pieces of the puzzle fold into this, as well as into a larger prevention plan. The other work group that we're going to get into is kinship and foster care. And so I know that you guys have done well in terms of utilizing kinship more than you were before. Yes, 43%, as the commissioner just reminded, but I think that there is, and I think the commissioner may share this, there's great opportunity here. I think if I heard correctly, your goal in Connecticut is 70%. And so that's going to take some effort to get there. You heard Mr. David mention that they used Kevin Campbell's Family Finders model. There are other tools and things that are out there to help us really hone in on kin as placements, not just our biological parents and family members, but also kin. Kin are a huge pool of resources for our kids, and let's be honest, we're a maternal society. We always think about mom, but we really have to also give credence to there are dads out there and paternal relatives who are more than willing to step up and to help us. So we get to continue the work that we've done around kin, but I also want to think about one other thing. So easy with regards to kin, we think about placement, but this is more than placement. This is about supports. And so we have often placed with our relatives and we're like, oh, they're yours. You know, we move on to the next kid that may be placed out of home with the core family. But if we take the time to really give the kin the support that they need, those stabilize those placements, and those are ways for kids to stay connected to their families. So moving on to our work group with regards to fiscal and revenue enhancement, and the question has already come up about, well, what about this particular example, which I scribbled down in my notebook, and we have someone tasked that will serve with us nationally as a fiscal consultant, and so I'm going to shoot that question to him after this to see if he can provide some feedback for us with regards to that specifically. But colors of money is the way I like to refer to it, and I know a lot of folks don't understand federal financing with regards to child welfare, but there's rules and regulations around every pot, and as easy as you'd like to just put it all in a blender and put it together and serve our families, it just doesn't work like that. And so we really have to think through, how do we leverage this new funding with regards to Family First? How do we maybe look at Medicaid expansion as we work with our partner, DEMIS? How do we then shift some of our state funds to cover things that now could be covered by Family First? So there's a lot of fiscal conversations, but as you can imagine, our fiscal group is going to be, again, tied to or hooked to our candidacy group. Because when you're thinking about who can we pay for, it looks at how you pay for it. So if you're thinking about this group, if you're someone with knowledge or information around Medicaid, or if you understand that AFDC look back, you understand Title IV funds, as well as just thinking creatively about braiding funds in ways that we may not have done before in Connecticut, this may be the work group for you. And our last, most robust work group is the one with regards to community partnerships and family and child engagement. This is our advocacy arm. We do not take lightly that your involvement is important. The way we are envisioning this group is not only is it an opportunity for you to engage and provide credence to the process, but this group is also going to have to be very intentional in making sure that the information links back to the other 4 groups. Because for you all to have a conversation in silo, it doesn't fully inform the process. So if something comes up in this stakeholder group, we're going to be running it back to candidacy if there's considerations that candidacy need to think about. They're going to run it back to kinship care and relative supports. And that's not to say that a provider or a parent or someone with lived experience couldn't volunteer to be on any one of those 4 groups. You very much could, but if you want an overarching group with regards to stakeholders at large, then this would be the group for you. So you really have to decide personally as well as professionally, depending on who or what you're representing, which group would make the most sense for you. But know that there is going to be very intentional opportunities for us to intersect those conversations. And so that's why it's so important for us to scribe and actually chronicle those discussions so that we're cross-sharing information as frequently as possible, especially considering I've already shared that we're about on a 6 to 7 month time frame, right? All right. So I know Mr. Meiseglen has already been out over the last several months with many of you because he's been getting the emails and the phone calls about FFPSA, but we're calling it Family First right now. What's going on? How does it impact me? And one of the things that he was able to communicate is he feels that there is overwhelming support from individuals and stakeholders in Connecticut. He feels like you all understand that it is the right thing to do. To serve families in least restrictive environments. You just want to know how. You want to understand the what next. So I applaud you all for being here today, and I thank you for being ready to jump in and help us through this process because this will be huge and monumental, but absolutely it will be worth it. We know that there are some challenges as we start to have the conversations about what this means for our system. And we know that this will be a shift for some of our frontline workers. Many of them have been very focused on risk for them as workers, but also risk to families. And sometimes it's a lot easier to just take them because then you don't really worry about what's going to happen next instead of just really focusing around safety. And so you probably heard the commissioner talk about a safety culture, that we really have to focus on safety. Yeah, there may be some risk, but if the kid is safe and there's an opportunity to wrap them with interventions and support, then home really is the best place for them. And so we have to figure out what that looks like and be comfortable. And also in that, we know that there's an opportunity for us to kind of help our workforce embrace that too, because folks are very reactionary and they're afraid, and we've seen bad things happen or get portrayed in the media. So we have to do a lot of work around that too, because we have to keep our families and kids on the forefront of what's important. And I love the question that came up about how do we get DEMIS and DDS and DSS and because you are absolutely correct. This has to be a collective impact opportunity across state agencies. DCF cannot and should not do this work alone. And so as long as we're all thinking about ways to embed this work across systems, one, for us to leverage funds differently, but to serve families where we're not bouncing them between systems, I think that this is a great opportunity. But it's great to say it, but it's hard work. And so we know that that is definitely going to be a challenge, but it's just a challenge that we're going to have to keep powering through to get the work done. And then we've already touched on it a little bit with regards to service models, that we have to be honest sometimes, that if we're funding some things currently that isn't either quality or isn't giving us good outcomes for kids, we have to have those tough conversations about whether or not that needs to remain in our continuum of interventions that we're going to use. And communication. Communication in a fast speed world is hard, but we are committed to being transparent. We're committed to being inclusive. We know that that will take a lot of work, and you'll see near the end of the slide presentation where we've kind of laid out what the feedback loop is. But communication is something that will be key to this process occurring. So some of you all may be thinking about, well, that is a lot. Why do we want to embark upon this journey? Because I think it was, I can't remember, Susan or Miranda who said, it's an option. Do we really have to do this? Yes, because it's good for kids. This is worth it because we give our parents the tools that they need to be better parents. We help our kids stay in their communities with their family, with their culture, with their ties. It helps them with their identity to know who they are and where they came from. So it's worth it. It gives our workers tools to do their jobs better. I won't say easy because this work is hard. If you've been in it, it is hard. But hopefully it will give them the resources to be better, to lay down at night and know that they did right by kids and by families. And lastly, as you just kind of build upon your efforts that you've already started, ideally, hopefully it will be a cost opportunity for us to infuse dollars into our system differently. All right, so with that said, who's in? We got some hands up? All right, see one or two, most of you guys are like hesitant, but we want everyone who is interested and who's ready to work to please join us in this effort. We have established a DCF Connecticut, and I said that backwards. No, I didn't. DCF Connecticut Family First at ct.gov. So this is a dedicated email inbox. So that if you have questions as you leave here today and you reflect upon, well, what did they say about that? Please send it to the email inbox. This will also be the way that you guys sign up to be a part of one of the respective work groups that we have outlined for you today. I would just ask that when you send in your submission by November 21st is when we're asking for it, so before Turkey Day, so that nobody forgets. Please include your name, your agency affiliation, or if you're a parent or stakeholder or whoever you're representing in the process. That's really helpful for us as we form out the work groups. And also your contact information. Can we please have your email address and your phone number so that we'll come up with a spreadsheet of all the folks who are represented in each of the groups. And so I've touched on group leads for you. I've already put Mr. Meisselglen on notice that he has to be with me on the 22nd, that we're going to be going through the submissions and realizing where we have representation in our groups, because we want to make sure that there's a good cross-section representation in any of the groups. We don't want them lopsided in any way, because it's good to have varied and different perspectives to be able to think about the whole. And then once we figure out who has submitted their interest in serving on the groups, ideally we can then figure out who the lead should be for the group. And then the following week, we're going to send out notifications to each of you all to let you know, yes, you're on X group. And by then, we would have been able to finalize where the work group meetings will be that first week in December. We're looking for centralized locations right now because we know folks will be traveling in from different places. But we're envisioning at the top of that, the week, the 25th, you guys will then have a full week to know when is the first work group meeting, where's the location, the time. But again, if you have questions, you can email us. And then, yeah, that's how you're going to get involved. So once you sign up and you're committed, and you may say, so what does that mean for getting to the finish line? Some of you I've already touched upon, or all of you, because we're in the same room, right? We talked about communication, and we know that we're going to be meeting. And so this feedback loop, basically in summary, what it says is, as you're working and you get stuck or you have a question, you can submit it to the inbox. You also can submit it to Ken or I. We're going to make sure that we're keeping that information flowing from the groups to the governance committee, who will be having dialogues and conversations about it. We also know that there will be a feedback loop once documents are submitted, because what I don't want to happen is you guys send us your plan and then the governance committee do their thing and then you never get any feedback, you never see it, you never know what happened. So ideally, as drafts get finalized by the governance committee, you guys will get that. And when I say you guys, I'm going to send it to the leads, and then the leads can send it to the larger group. It'll also be posted on our DCF website that we've created specific to Family First, that'll be on the last slide for you guys to write that down. And then if we have questions, if the governance committee has questions and we send it back through the lead, we're going to be asking for a 5-day business turnaround, because we're trying to write the plan, and so we won't have weeks for people to give us that information to inform the process. So that's the only one that has a time frame on it on this slide, and that's if we need additional information from you all, the 5 business days. But other than that, as soon as the plan gets submitted for Governor Office approval, we're going to send that out as a draft. When we submit to ACF, we will send that out to you guys as a draft. And when we get it final, we're just going to celebrate. Maybe the commissioner will have a whole press release. I don't know. But it will be huge, and we'll be super excited when we get that done over the summer. So thank you all for listening to all of us today. It has been a pleasure to share information with you with regards to Family First. There's that DCF work group email box that we talked about a few minutes ago, dcfctfamilyfirst@ct.gov. The next link is actually the same link that Susan gave you earlier in terms of just being a resource for a wealth of information specific to Family First, and it's familyfirstact.org. And then our newly unveiled Connecticut website is ctfamilyfirst.ct.gov. And so as we go through this process and we learn of when work groups are scheduled, we'll have a calendar out there. When we learn of who the work groups are comprised of, we'll post that. When we have presentations for today, that will be out on that website as well. So remember, I talked about we are committed to communication and being transparent. That's where you can go if you want to find out what's going on specific in Connecticut. And if you know if there's something out there that we haven't been swift enough to get up there that you want to see up there, please email the inbox or Ken or I, and we'll make sure that we get that up there, because we are not doing this in a vacuum at all. So, yes, I see a question.
I have a question. I'm a little OCD myself, and I already looked at all the information last night, so I tried to send a message to the ct.gov address.
The email address, it's corrected. So we can tell you, because we had that same heartache on Friday, and whoever created it put periods between each word. And so we reached out and had them correct that this morning. So try it again, and please let us know if it isn't working. But I think
it is up and running.
Yes.
Another question: is it going to be, or is your site going to be in multiple languages?
Yes.
My colleague says yes. Other questions? No? All right, I'll take that as I did an exceptional job. So thank you.
I do like to thank Joshonda and Ken and Michael for their work to kind of set up this forum to make sure that we got you the information that you needed. And I'll leave you with this as we kind of think about how we talk to each other and network as we leave today, that in Connecticut we have 4,226 children in care. 4,226 children in care. What would our system look like if it reflected our values? Have a good night, you guys.